We'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back to another Leader Factor webinar. If you can hear me and if you can see me, go ahead and put a yes in the chat. I want to make sure we're looking good here. Yes, excellent. Natalie, Molly, Sherry, thank you guys. Okay, first thing I'd love for you to do is if you would put your location in the chat. We always love doing that, so go ahead and do that. And if you have had any good news or something meaningful happen this week, go ahead and put that in the chat too. I want to see what's going on with everybody this week. This week for me, I finished tiling a bathroom. We're doing a remodel at our house and I finished that up this week.
That's
and so
pretty
we're feeling
brave.
pretty good.
That's pretty brave, Junior.
I know. It is pretty brave.
Yeah, very
Karen
handy.
won some client business, got an ideal project. Love to hear it. Marcos from Spain. Andrea, the Green Bay Packers won. I don't know if we got any more Packers fans in the chat, but that's a good thing. St. George, Utah.
Two daughters getting married.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Thank you for sharing that.
Congratulations. Jody from Portland, Oregon, the air quality is only unhealthy today. That's an improvement. That is an improvement.
Tara said that she's buying a new house this week.
Oh, that's awesome.
Mark said he just finished a woodworking project.
Very cool.
Right on.
Oh, and somehow with the beard, you don't look like a junior. So I get better customer service at Cabela's, Bass Pro, and Home Depot. That's what I tell people. That's the beard. It's strategic, just so you all know.
It really does. You blend in with that demographic.
That's right. Go Pack Go. We got a lot of Packers in the chat today.
Okay, good.
Good. All right, we got a lot of people from a lot of different places, and it sounds like we got a lot of good things going on this week.
So Junior, I got to say this one though. Tim Shea said, I woke up above ground today.
Oh, love it. always a good thing to be able to say. Always a good thing to be able to say.
Mr. Shea.
Well, we hope to add to the good things that have happened to you this week with this webinar. We're thrilled to have you all back. We really are. One of the things that we're happy with, we keep seeing the Amazon reviews go up for the book. And so if you haven't had a chance to check out the 4 stages of psychological safety, go ahead and check it out. And if you've read it and enjoyed it, and even if you didn't, we would still ask you to leave a review, giving us your honest opinion on the book. That helps spread it and get it to more people. We think that it's an important topic that's important for the world today. And so that's one thing that you could do today that would help us out, is leave an Amazon review on the book. Okay, couple housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded, and all of you will be sent a recording of this session probably Monday of next week, along with any other resources that we talk about. We like to send out those post-webinar emails and make sure that you have access to everything that we're talking about today. All of the links that we'll be talking about today will be put in the chat throughout the webinar. So registrations for the 4 stages certification, the Eq-Ometer certification, the upcoming webinar, those types of things will be in the chat today. Another thing, inside the chat, make sure that you put all panelists and attendees when you're messaging the group. We want to make sure that everybody can see the chat. The chat has some really rich dialogue and is always going on behind the scenes of the webinar. So make sure to engage in the chat. There's a lot of valuable information there. So with that, we will go ahead and get started today. Today is a follow-up on our last webinar from a couple weeks ago on emotional intelligence. And today we're talking about why the traditional EQ model is broken. We're convinced that it is, but in addition to telling you what could be improved, we're going to tell you what the solution is. So we're not just going to poke holes, we're going to fill those holes and tell you about the Eq-Ometer model and some of the things that we think will be really helpful for you as you're exploring emotional intelligence. And so hopefully this is valuable to you. We will be having another webinar in 2 weeks as a follow-up to this one. So today we're going to go over the model. We'll tell you what improvements we have tried to make. And then we're going to tell you how to apply that model and measure emotional intelligence in the next webinar. So go ahead and stick around because we're going to talk about that and give you the registration link for that next webinar. So today you will probably recognize that with us we have Dr. Timothy Clark. He is the CEO and founder of Leader Factor. He's an Oxford PhD, a Fulbright and British research scholar. He's the developer of the Eq-Ometer instrument, which we will show you, and the 4 stages of psychological safety team survey. Probably many of you here today have come through the 4 stages channel, and we're happy to have you with us. These 2 competencies are very complementary. These skill areas, these domains, they have a lot to do with each other, a very, very strong connection and relationship that we'll talk about in an ongoing fashion. But we're really passionate about these 2 things. So today we're going to talk about EQ and personality, EQ and manipulation. We're going to talk about 2 competencies that you may not have heard of, and we're going to talk about the relationship between EQ and psych safety. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Clark to get us going.
Let's get going. Thanks, Junior. And hi, everybody from all around the world. It's great to have you with us. And hopefully we can have quite a discussion here. So use your chat box very liberally because we want to incorporate your feedback, your input, your questions, and we want to have a rich dialogue today. Let's begin with emotional intelligence and personality. First of all, are they the same things? What do you think? Go to your chat box. Is emotional intelligence and personality, are they the same things? What would you say if you're trying to explain this to someone? Hey, can you explain to me the difference between emotional intelligence and personality? What would you say?
We got patently no.
Patently no.
We got no
Okay.
with 5 O's.
Okay, right.
A lot of no's.
But they're related, right? They're related. So let's jump into this a little bit. Emotional intelligence, a basic definition, is that it's the ability to interact effectively with other humans. Isn't that really the essence of the concept? Isn't that really what we're talking about? Now, we can talk about how we measure it, and we can talk about all the skill areas. It is a multidimensional variable. When you measure it, you try to deconstruct the concept. But the basic concept is that we're talking about being effective with other humans. Okay, but how is that related to personality? Back to our original question. Here's what most behavioral scientists around the world now conclude, and there's really a consensus view about this now, that emotional intelligence is a learnable skill, but personality is a fixed trait. Now, maybe not completely, right? But core disposition and temperament remains, in most people, it remains relatively fixed over time. How many of you have ever taken a personality test, like, for example, Myers-Briggs? Raise your hand. We've all done that. How many of you have taken it twice? So I remember taking it originally many years ago, and then I took it again about 5 years later, and then I took it again about 5 years later, and it was pretty much the same, right? So that's confirming evidence, and we probably have all done that, that core disposition and temperament remains relatively fixed over time. Emotional intelligence is related to your personality. It reflects your personality in many ways, but it's a learnable skill. So that's the difference. Okay, but now we're going to talk about a very interesting aspect of personality, or an attribute that we call charisma. And I want to tell you a story. This is a true story. This happened to me. So a few years back, when I was managing an organization, I made what I would call a charisma hire. Does this make sense? I hired someone on the basis of their personality, in particular, their charisma. Now, what is charisma? What is charisma? Here's a definition from the dictionary: a compelling attractiveness or charm that can inspire devotion in others. So this individual that I hired had a certain magnetism and charm and style that was very attractive. And I kind of and I'm sorry to say it, but I took the bait and I was pulled in by that magnetism and that charm and that attractiveness. And I hired this individual and I was blinded to really think about or consider other attributes and really vet this candidate. And I hired this individual and I lived to regret it. And it was very, very painful because this individual came into the organization in a leadership role. And this individual left a wake of destruction and still had the charisma, right? But didn't know how to work effectively with other people. So charisma it's kind of an ineffable quality. It's difficult to duplicate. It's difficult to train. But it's an attribute of personality. And so we learned something very interesting. We learned about what I might call the dark side of charisma. So what's the dark side of charisma? So go ahead and answer this question. Let's talk about this a little bit. The dark side of charisma. Charisma's, Junior, we talked about this the other day. It's not bad, right?
No, it's not bad. I have to call this joke though. Jim's like, and Junior still works for you.
That's right.
Oh, I love it. Jim, that was good. We do talk about this. Charisma is not bad. Charisma is not, if anything, it's inherently positive.
It's a good attribute.
Right? It's a good attribute.
Yeah.
And so let's not get that mixed up. But I think that there is a dark side. So let's check in the chat. We've got egocentric.
So Ann just made a really good point. She said, charisma has the ability to hide other attributes. And I think that's where the problem is.
Yeah.
Because as you said, Junior, charisma is not inherently bad. It's actually a positive attribute.
Yeah.
We like it.
It's interesting. So David said charisma might get to slide past accountability. That's interesting. I think that can happen. Let's see. Mark says manipulative. So I think that can be true, right? It's not necessarily true as we're saying, but it can be. Narcissistic, never hire the smart jerk. It's Machiavellian, manipulative.
Right.
Okay. It can feel manipulative and inauthentic.
And it can. I think the overall point, and I think Ann said it best. So Ann, you get full credit here. I think you have shared with us the critical insight that charisma, because of the magnetism and the attractiveness of it, it hides other things. And it's beguiling. It's beguiling to the point that we may get sloppy or careless as we are vetting candidates for a hire or for promotion. So it's very interesting. So it just gives us an example of personality versus emotional intelligence, because this individual that I hired had some gifts of personality, no question.
Yeah.
Obvious gifts of personality. Emotional intelligence was terrible.
Yeah.
Self-awareness was terrible. Empathy was terrible, right?
I think so. Hector said charisma can become a disguise. And I like that point a lot, because in your scenario, in a hiring situation, you've got to peel back that filter of charisma and see what's behind it. Because as Chris said, it can be a good thing if there's substance, right? Yeah. If there's substance there, then charisma, I think, can amplify a lot of the good traits that you possess. And so it is a good thing by itself.
That's right.
But it can be dangerous, which I think is the point.
So here's a lesson for all of us. If you encounter a person with charisma, that's fantastic, but you have an obligation to go deeper in your analysis and your evaluation, because as Hector said, it could be a disguise and then it becomes dangerous. And so then we have this opportunity to meet the dark side of charisma, and that can be unpleasant. It certainly was for me. And I had to mop up this situation, and it took me a year to mop it up, and it was very painful. So there's definitely a lesson here.
I also want to make it very clear that charisma is not synonymous with emotional intelligence.
That's right.
And I think that most people understand that, but sometimes we get it wrong. We see someone who's very charismatic and we say, wow, what high EQ, right? And we're going to show you that that's not what we mean.
It's not EQ.
It's not EQ.
And then one more point that I want to make here to everybody is that in years past, hopefully we're not still doing this, but we have many organizations have worshiped at the altar of charisma. And doing that has done untold harm to organizations because they went in blind looking for charismatic leaders, and they didn't do the due diligence that was necessary to really vet people, individuals, and they lived to pay the consequence, right, to reap the consequences of that. And it's been a painful chapter in organizational history. Hopefully we've learned our lessons. I hope so. So here's the way that we distinguish between the two. Emotional intelligence is a learnable skill. You can see that wrapped around personality with an emphasis on the fact that core temperament and disposition are usually fixed. And then the emotional intelligence is the learnable skill. It's something that we can develop. It's something that we can get better at, right? Very, very important to understand. So the next time that you're in a conversation about charisma, or you see someone with charisma, you understand that it is an inherently good thing, but you understand that you have more work to do. You've got more work to do. And you certainly cannot hire on the basis of charisma alone, or you may live to regret that day, right? Okay. So, as we said, to summarize, emotional intelligence is a learnable skill. It's something you can change, you can improve on through focus and practice and effort. All right. So let's go to a polling question. Do we have this polling question, Junior?
I don't think we do. So
okay.
Let's go ahead and put it in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead and answer the question that you guys see. Have you ever been fooled by a person's charisma into believing they were a high performer when they actually were not?
So as you're putting in your answers, I want to give you a related concept. We call this the rhetorical career. Now I want you to think about this. This is the dark side of charisma, where someone talks a good game, but they can't back it up. So their career becomes rhetorical. All they know is to talk, and so we just talk our way through problems. We just talk. That's the only thing that we can do. That's a rhetorical career. And some people do that, and some people are socialized and they're trained by others and they're taught that is leadership. And it's a very sad thing to see, right? You will sometimes see people who have led rhetorical careers. They don't roll up their sleeves and get in there and get dirty. And so be on the lookout for that. It's just something that we need to be aware of. Any comment on that, Junior?
Well, I knew we were going to get a lot of yeses in the chat, but I don't think I appreciated just how many and how deep, because it looks like a lot of people, some of them made the mistake of hiring for charisma. Others inherited someone else's mistake of hiring for charisma, which is another thing. Then you have to deal with that. And so, yeah, a lot of people have had this issue.
So here's a telltale sign. So the person who leads a rhetorical career will always tell you that they can do it. Whatever needs to be done. Oh yeah, I can do that. I've done that. No problem. I can do it. And this is where we make our mistakes. Do not rely on someone's response, someone's confirmation in making a hiring decision or delegating an important assignment, you have to go beyond that, and you have to look for evidence of track record. You have to find track record. Rhetoric is one thing, track record is something very different. And sometimes we're so hopeful and we want to believe and we want to be optimistic and we want to believe this person can do it. And we say, oh, great, let's go. Because yes, you've confirmed that you can do it. It's not enough. So you gotta pull in on the reins. You gotta stop yourself, and you have to look for evidence of track record. So just keep that in mind. Okay, now here's a related issue: emotional intelligence and manipulation. Now this will take us into this next discussion. Let's think about the relationship between these two things. Okay, now you may have seen this quote before from Maya Angelou. She said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." If you've been in the presence of a manipulator, if you've been working with a manipulator, if you've spent a lot of time with a manipulator, if you're on the receiving end of that manipulation, what does that feel like? What do you feel like? So if you have a comment, put it in the chat box.
Used, slimy, crazy, manipulated, angry, stupid, irritated, betrayed, a roller coaster. I identify with that one. It can be a roller coaster.
Yep.
Let down, cheated.
Yeah.
Not validated.
You instinctively and intuitively, it doesn't feel right. Yeah. There's something off, right? Because with manipulation, what is off is the intent. The intent is off. The motivation is off. There's an ulterior motive. You are a means, not an end. Manipulators look at other people as a means, not an end. And that's never true. That's never right. Humans are always the end. And that's you can't argue with that. Okay, but let's jump into this a little bit more. Let me show you a conceptual tool that we use with organizations that's called the spectrum of influence. So I want you to think about the way that we influence people. So here's the spectrum. It's just a line that goes from left to right. At one end, we have manipulation. Manipulation, here's a definition. Manipulation is control through deception. That's what it is. Control through deception. Now, here's the other end. Coercion is the other end of the spectrum of influence. What is coercion? Control through force. So we have control through deception. That's manipulation. And we have control through force. That's coercion. If you have wandered to the left or to the right in the way that you're interacting and trying to influence other people, you got off track. You need to come back to the middle. What's in the middle? Let's talk about the middle. The word that we use is persuasion. So I've got a question that I want to talk to you about, that Junior and I want to talk to you about. What are the tools of legitimate influence in the middle of the spectrum? What are the tools of persuasion? So I'm not going to go to manipulation, and I'm not going to go to coercion, because I've basically abdicated. So what do I use? Okay, let's take a look at these, Junior.
Empathy, modeling, humility. Tim says curiosity. Amel, dialogue. Cameron, a business case. Ruben,
questions.
Vision, clarity, and mission.
Listening, says Brad. Knowledge.
A motivating vision. Humble inquiry. I love that, because sometimes we inquire just to inquire. Humble inquiry is another angle, and I really like that addition. That's nice.
Yep.
Transparency, openness, and listening. Brad says genuine engagement. I like these qualifiers. Genuine, right? Engagement for engagement is not enough. It needs to be genuine. Vulnerability, curiosity. So there's an element of humility that's coming through in a lot of these comments, right? curiosity, I think, is inherently humble.
Yeah. Well, it means that you're genuinely, you're truly interested to understand. And so you bring that intent. Now, let me just say a word about intent. Human beings can smell intent. It's a native, inherent, inborn capability that we all have. We can smell intent. And so if a person comes to you with manipulative intent, you can smell that they will not pass the smell test, right? They're not going to pass the smell test. So you'll be on to that. So I just want you to think about, particularly in the current context, Junior, I mean, think about this with the pandemic, with racial tension, with a lot going on, the thing that, I mean, we're already in a pressurized situation, and we want to be able to interact with people that come to us with pure intent. No manipulation, no coercion, right? These are the instruments of control. So with manipulation, what do people do? They get out their tricks.
Yeah.
With coercion, what do people do? They get out their power tools, right? We don't want that. We don't want tricks. We don't want power tools. We want honest, genuine, pure intent. And we want people to bring the tools of persuasion, the tools of legitimate influence. And then we can really get something done. And then when they walk away, and we think about Maya Angelou's quote, what feeling did they leave us with?
One of the things that I want to talk about too, that I think is an interesting angle on this topic, is that I think increasingly there's less tolerance for manipulation and there's less tolerance for coercion. I think especially in really talented populations, and you and I have talked about this before, where A players particularly won't stand for it. And I think that if you look at tolerance longitudinally, there's certainly less tolerance today for those types of behaviors than there was 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Certainly, right?
It's really true. It's really
so
true. And
go ahead.
Go ahead, Junior. Sorry.
Well, I think that we need to pay attention to that, because what is one of the biggest fights in every industry right now is fight for talent. And so if you want to attract and retain talent, then persuasion is the only way to go in any sustainable way. Short term, you can get production through manipulation and coercion, but it's short-sighted and it'll burn out.
It will. It'll burn out. This is a really good point from Sarah. If others still distrust, she says, I think you need to demonstrate through small actions and work to slowly build trust, right? And that's very true, because let's think about trust. Trust is the predictive understanding of another person's behavior. It's predictive understanding. I can predict you, and I want to be able to predict that you're well-intentioned and that you're going to come to me with pure and clean intent, and that we can get something done that's special, right? We can solve a problem. We can come up with a solution. Okay, so let's keep going. Now we're going to come back to emotional intelligence on this, because we got to create some clarity. What we have here in front of you is the original definition of emotional intelligence from Peter Salovey and Jack Mayer, from that original seminal groundbreaking article that they published in 1990, right? That started really the revolution in EQ. Here's what they said. They said emotional intelligence, a form of social intelligence that involves the ability to monitor one's own and others' feelings and emotions. Okay, that's awareness. So that first piece of this definition is about awareness. And then they say to discriminate among them, the feelings and emotions, right, that you can see and perceive, and use this information to guide your thinking and your action. That's behavior. So the two fundamental components of their original definition of emotional intelligence were awareness on the one hand and behavior on the other. Now that's fantastic. And that has stood the test of time, but there's a gap. So we're going to talk about that. The gap is that they're not accounting for intent. And if we don't account for intent, we can encounter people who are highly skilled in awareness and in behavior, but they lack the intent, and so they become manipulators. And so the model that we now use for emotional intelligence, let me show it to you. It includes 3 components, not just awareness and behavior, as you can see in the bottom 2 circles, but also beliefs, because if we can measure beliefs, we understand we can get to a person's intent, the motivational basis for their behavior. Okay, so let me show you, Junior, any comments on this?
One of the things I do want to talk about really quickly, and it has to do with this entire conversation. So Nikki's saying, how do you penetrate a sector in which, talking about the spectrum of influence, they use both ends so dominantly, and there's not a lot of persuasion. And I just want to address this. I think land and expand, penetrate and radiate, you have to start where you are. If the people at the top are part of that behavior, it can be very difficult. Certainly that would be the most effective and the most leveraged place to start, but it's often impossible. And so what you have to do is do what you can. You have to start where you are. You have to start in a local environment. It can be a very, very small intact team. But we talk about this with psychological safety as well. The fruits come. The confirmation comes from the behaviors. And so if you see a team with high EQ, high psychological safety, a leader, a single leader or a business unit leading through persuasion, it's very difficult to argue with the results that will come from that unit over time. Because almost inevitably over time, and that's a key thing, over time, the results will speak for themselves.
Yeah. To your point, so Phyllis she said beachhead. That's very good. So there are 2 ways to transform the organization, right? The Junior has laid out. The traditional way is top down. We're going to cascade down from the top, from those who hold positional power. And that's always the ideal way. But the other way is a beachhead approach. You gain a foothold, you gain some traction, you gain a beachhead wherever you can, and then you radiate from there. So that's the land and expand. And most of us we have to do this in our careers. If you'll notice, Junior and I are not members of the same generation. I know that's a shock to you, but it's true. So I spent a few years in heavy manufacturing early in my career. And I got to tell you, it was a pretty toxic environment in many ways. Well, what do? If you have limited authority, limited influence, you do what you can where you are, and you try to create a refuge, a sanctuary of inclusion where you are, so that you can collaborate, you create a healthy culture where you are, you do what you can. You have to do that. That's our moral imperative, to do that wherever we are.
So back to the 3 components of EQ and talking about beliefs, one of the reasons that we talked about charisma is because it's a danger that presents itself when we evaluate leaders or anyone using the traditional model that doesn't account for belief. For example, if I'm a highly charismatic leader, but I have poor intent, how would I score on the traditional model? I could potentially score very well. I could potentially come back with glowing results and say, I have fantastic EQ. Or if someone evaluates me, even in a multi-rater survey, using the traditional framework that doesn't account for intent, I may come back with a glowing review. And people would say, well, as far as awareness and behavior, I have to say this person does a fantastic job. but
Right.
we're not asking about the beliefs, the intent, the motivation that really make or break the leader. And so we're
That's right.
missing just a huge piece. I think this is crucial.
It's a huge component. It's a huge component. And Adam Grant from University of Pennsylvania, he underscored the point when he said, new evidence suggests that when people have self-serving motives, right? Motives, motivation and intent, that's what we're talking about. Emotional intelligence becomes a weapon for manipulating others. So this is where we have had to call a timeout in the last couple of years and say, hang on a second. Let's look at the way that we're measuring emotional intelligence. We have a big gap because, as Junior said, you can be phenomenal in your awareness skills and maybe in your self-regulation and your ability to influence others, but the intent's not there. You're a manipulator and you use your skills to control others through that manipulation. And so do you really have high emotional intelligence? I don't think so. Not in the true sense of the word. Okay, so what have we done? How have we been able to fix this model? This is what we've done. We've added 2 competencies to the traditional model of emotional intelligence. And those 2 competencies are self-regard and social regard. So let me show you, and Junior, chime in here. So let me just show you the traditional model. The traditional model is right here. It consists of these 4 competencies. So self-awareness and social awareness. What do you perceive? What are you aware of as it relates to yourself? And what are you aware of that's going on around you as you are monitoring social dynamics, as you're reading the room, as you're trying to perceive and read the emotions of other people? These are the awareness competencies. And then to the right, we have the behavior competencies. Self-management. This is your regulation ability. You're regulating, you're controlling yourself. So self-management means to control yourself. Social management does not mean to control others. We don't control others. We influence others. So we control ourselves, we influence others. Those are the behavior competencies. So those 4, there's self-management, there's social management. Those 4 constitute the traditional model of emotional intelligence. Now we're going to add to it. So Junior, you want to talk about these a little bit?
I do. So one of the things that I want to talk about leading into this is a question that came up in the chat and a few people are wondering about. If intent is the gap, curious why you chose beliefs as the 3rd dimension. To me, beliefs is upstream from intent. It comes even before. What do you believe fundamentally about yourself? And what do you believe about other people? And I think it's just a generally more appropriate word when you're talking about yourself and other people. And so that's why I think that intent, there's an interesting difference there that we need to take into consideration. And I think that belief is more fundamental. So self-regard, social regard. And you can see how these intersect. What do I believe about myself? Self-regard. What do I believe about other people? And so inside here, in social regard, for example, we're going to have empathy, respect, interest, social efficacy, and compassion. Okay? So think about those 5 dimensions for a second, and then ask yourself the question, could I accurately evaluate myself or someone else in their leadership capability or their leadership performance without addressing those dimensions? Do you think you could be an effective leader or get an effective measurement on yourself if you don't take into consideration those things? It becomes very clear. You absolutely need to look at them. Self-regard, independence, optimism, motivation, confidence, and self-respect. They're very important things for everyone.
Now let me address a question, because I just saw a comment where someone is assuming that awareness that belief is just an extension of awareness and that they're really the same thing. Let me explain how that absolutely is not the case. So I had a member of my team that was incredibly aware of herself and the people around her. So her awareness quotient was off the charts. But her sense of self-regard was incredibly low based on self-efficacy, self-respect, and confidence. So look at those dimensions that are in the self-regard competency. And so therefore, she would not engage because that brought down her overall level of self-efficacy and self-worth. So your self-regard, what you actually believe about yourself, is very different than your awareness of yourself. And that propels you to engage in a different way. Equally or similarly, I should say, let's think about social regard. Social regard is what you believe about other people. So do you believe that they are inherently of worth? Do you believe in their inherent intrinsic worth? You may be aware of what's going on. You may be aware of them. You may be aware of yourself, but your sense of social regard will equip you with your motive and your intent as you engage with other people. So for example, let's go back to another person that I worked with that would with the traditional model had exceptionally high emotional intelligence, but had quite a disdain for people of lower rank than himself. So his sense of social regard for other people was extremely low. He had a high sense of awareness. He was very tuned into what was going on, but there was a disdain for people who were lower in the social hierarchy than he was. So that low sense of social regard informed his intent or defined his intent. And when you would try to collaborate with him, he was incredibly arrogant, filled with hubris, and it was almost impossible to work with him. His awareness was very high, but his regard competencies were very low, which had a profound effect on his ability to collaborate effectively with others. Right? So I think that we have to distinguish intent, self-regard, what you believe about yourself and others is different than what you know about yourself and others. Do they bleed into each other? Sure they do. And then we go to behavior, your actual behavior, and then the way that you influence others. So the multidimensional variable that emotional intelligence is, it's not easy to measure. It's never been easy to measure, but we can clearly see that we've had a gap in not addressing intent. So let me show you another statement that I think helps in what we're trying to explain here. So this is Dr. Nathan Brandon, one of the foremost experts in self-esteem research. And here's what he said. Research shows that a well-developed sense of personal value, right, self-regard, correlates significantly with kindness, generosity, social cooperation, and a spirit of mutual aid. We cannot understand a person's behavior without understanding the self-concept behind it. That has not been in our attempts to measure emotional intelligence in the past. And that's why we've needed to bring it in, because we have to be able to control for the tendency to manipulate. Any comment, Junior? Questions or comments from our audience?
I think the one line reason of the change in framework is to measure intent. You cannot measure emotional intelligence accurately without looking at intent. And one of the important things to understand is they do bleed into each other, right? They're not just all of these distinct 30 categories that comprise a person, and that's it. I think that that's important to realize, and that these constructs, they're put together based on everything we have available to us to accurately measure EQ, which to this point has been, a relatively elusive thing, and has really come into picture during the last, what would you say, Tim, 30 years, 20 years?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's go back to the original definition of emotional intelligence without the clinical aspects of it. Emotional intelligence is your overall ability to interact effectively with other human beings. Is that not profoundly affected by the sense of self-regard you have, what you believe about yourself and what you believe about other people? Let me give you an example from adolescent research. If you're working with an adolescent that has a very low sense of a very low self-concept, very low sense of self-esteem, and you're interacting with them, how do they behaviorally interact with you if you begin to talk to them? Go ahead and hit the chat for this. If I'm working with an adolescent that has extremely low self-esteem, self-worth, low self-concept, how do they behaviorally interact with you if you try to talk to them? What do they do?
Because timid. Heather, they might bully. Tanya, they're self-deprecating, they're defensive, withdrawn.
They're withdrawn.
Leave me alone.
Yep.
Probably don't listen.
That's exactly right. So the defining attribute or characteristic of an individual with a low self-concept is that they withdraw. They do not engage. Does that not affect their ability to be effective in interpersonal relationships? Most of the time, they won't even look you in the face. They won't look you in the eyes. It has a profound, direct behavioral correlation to their ability to be effective in interpersonal relationships. And it's absolutely without. That's a finding that we don't argue anymore. Okay. Okay. Here's just some questions, and we won't spend a lot of time on this, but just some questions that you can take with you. Why does emotional intelligence include beliefs in addition to awareness and behavior? We've talked a little bit about this. This is something that you can ruminate on, take a little bit more time to ponder. How do self-regard and social regard connect to a person's potential tendency to manipulate others? Manipulation is always traceable to intent. Remember, manipulation is control through deception. Coercion is control through force. And then finally, third question, why are forms of manipulation and coercion illegitimate forms of influence? Because they do not value the human being as the end, but they look upon the human being as perhaps a means. Okay, now here's the last connection, and then we can do a little Q&A. The connection to psychological safety is very important.
What do you guys think it is, too? What do you think the connection is between EQ and psych safety? I'd love to see some comments in the chat on this.
Okay.
Just out of curiosity, what do you guys think? What is the relationship between emotional intelligence and psychological safety? Did I stump the chat? I may have stumped the chat. Self-awareness, empathy. Without EI, you can't promote psychological safety. Okay, now you're flooding it. I feel less safe around someone who's low in EQ. Okay, there we go.
Okay.
I think emotional intelligence can contribute to psychological safety. Psychological safety is reflective of self-regard and social regard. That's interesting. I haven't thought about it specifically that way. Without EI, you won't get psychological safety. With high EQ, you can sense when an environment is psychologically safe. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, good point.
EQ brings authenticity, which allows for psychological safety. That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, you guys are hitting on it, and I think that this is interesting. We understand intuitively. It's pretty intuitive, right?
So let me bring in one more point and another stream of research that goes to the issue of what sociologists and social psychologists call surface acting. So I want you to think about this. Surface acting means that you are trying to express an emotion that you don't actually feel. And the reason that you're trying to do that is because that is the emotional labor that is required to do your job. For example, you go into a retail location, so a store of some kind, and an associate, a service attendant comes out to help you, and they're trying to be friendly and kind and warm. But what if they don't actually feel that? What if it's not a real emotion that's in them? Then what do? You try to manufacture that emotion. That is what we call surface acting. And my favorite research on this is by Professor Hochschild at UC Berkeley. But this helps us understand that real emotional intelligence you can't produce it based on surface acting. It has to be real, it has to be authentic. And if it's not, then we can smell that. So I just wanted to add that because I think it's so very, very important. So again, emotional intelligence without the intent can be very superficial, very disingenuous. I mean, where's it coming from, right? Are you surface acting or is this the real thing?
I think one of the things I like about Tim's comment about calling out self and social regard as kind of prerequisites for building psychological safety is so interesting, because you could get by and have a relatively psychologically safe environment without the other two domains. Not that you would want to or not work on those, but those are really the key, right? Regard. I think people feel that, and that's what creates or breaks a psychologically safe environment. So in the next slide, you'll see where the sequence that we use is
Yeah.
that EQ leads to psychological safety, which leads to career impact for the individual and business impact for the organization. So one of the ways to look at this, just an angle for you, is that psychological safety is in some sense the collective EQ of whatever social collective it is that we're talking about, right? EQ is an individual metric. Psychological safety is a group metric. And so if you're trying to address the psychological safety of an entire group, one of the levers that you have to pull is emotional intelligence at the individual level. Because in aggregate, as our EQ improves, our beliefs, our behaviors, our awareness, as those things get better, psychological safety will improve. That's how we see it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. And by the way, Ben, maybe you can put in the chat box a link. So I published an article in Forbes today that is titled How to Choose the Right Executive. And I give some examples, and I talk about emotional intelligence as being one of the critical factors that we need to look at in making executive selection. And I give an example that you might find compelling. So I'll just leave you a little bit in suspense. But emotional intelligence is absolutely crucial to effectiveness.
Yeah, go ahead and check it out for sure. So we don't have too much time left, so we'll go pretty quickly through these last few slides. The last few slides are on psychological safety. If you haven't had an opportunity to hear what we think about psychological safety, we'd invite you to check out some of the past webinars. So some of you may have seen this already, but on the website, in the blog and the webinars tab, we link back to a few of these webinars in which we go through each of the stages, one webinar per stage, We talk about measuring psychological safety. To put it simply, we believe that psychological safety is a stage-based phenomenon, that it's not binary. We start with inclusion safety. Do we feel accepted? And as respect and permission increase in the environment, we move our way through learner safety, contributor safety, and finally challenger safety, where do we feel safe to challenge the status quo? And if we do, then the environment will help us produce more innovation, and we will all feel included. We'll have productive teams and we'll be able to compete in a dynamic environment. And EQ, going back to that relationship, is what starts at the individual level to help build a psychologically safe environment. Okay, so one of the things I want to call out, Tim, if you'll go a couple slides forward, the book. If you haven't had a chance to check out the book, it's on Amazon, 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. If you've had it and read it, please leave us a review. We would appreciate that very much. A couple of things I want to call out, okay? The next webinar is going to be how to measure emotional intelligence. So if you were around for the webinar, how to measure psychological safety, this one will be very similar in format. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen in just a second after we get through the next couple slides, because we have a giveaway that I want you to be aware of. So Eq-Ometer, we've been talking about EQ. The next webinar, we'll talk about how to measure EQ. We measure EQ using the Eq-Ometer platform. And this is our product in the EQ space. And we measure using the 6 competency model that we shared with you today. So to enter that giveaway, we're going to have you post on LinkedIn about your experience today. You'll tag LeaderFactor and you'll share the link, leaderfactor.com/webinars. And we'll pick 8 people to receive a complimentary license to the Eq-Ometer platform. And I'll just steal the screen from Tim real quick to show you around, because I think that would be helpful to you so you can see a little bit about what this looks like. So it's 180 items. It takes about 15 minutes to complete. We use an 11-point scale. You'll get an overall score, top and bottom dimensions, and then this competency model will look pretty familiar to you. We just went through it. You'll see self-regard, social regard, awareness, and the management competencies. You'll be able to click into these and look at definitions, behavioral examples, development tips, and resources that we curate for you. We have learning materials in here, micro-learning videos, a lot of cool content in here, action planner, a retake, really robust user management. So if you're interested in learning about this, you have a chance to use the platform and get an annual license for free by sharing those things on LinkedIn. Okay, another thing, we have a certification date finalized for the Eq-Ometer certification. It's on October 22nd. From 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Mountain Time. If you go to leaderfactor.com/certifications, you'll be able to see the available dates for both the 4 Stages certification and the Eq-Ometer certification. We asked you guys a few weeks ago if you'd be interested in an Eq-Ometer cert, and you said yes. And so I got a lot of emails about that. We went ahead and put a session date on the calendar. Right now, we're only offering 1 because we've got a lot of 4 Stages certifications going on, but we were able to squeeze it in there. Okay, we got 2 minutes left. Go ahead and throw some questions in the chat and we'll answer a few of these. We'll probably go a couple minutes after the hour if you want to hang out with us. If you do have to jump off at the top of the hour, we want to say thank you for attending this webinar. Thank you for your participation in the chat. We appreciate all of your perspectives, your questions, your penetrating questions, your disagreements, all of those things we appreciate. It provides for very rich dialogue and helps us all get access to the best information.
We do, and one of the things that we say always is, and let me come back to this because this is a good parting thought for those of you who can't stay for Q&A, but I want to come back to the way that we frame this. It is vitally important in every organization, every team, every social collective, and of course, every family, that we raise intellectual friction so that we can solve problems, so that we can come up with solutions, so that we can innovate, so that we can advance. But we have to keep the social friction down as the intellectual friction is coming up. How do you do that? You do that by maintaining respect. You do that by avoiding personal attacks. You do that by just maintaining civility and dignity in the discourse. And as you know, we're struggling to do this in our society today. This is something that we all really need to work on. And I hope you agree with that, because if we're patrolling the borders of respect, we can keep the intellectual friction going in a very productive way. If we allow the social friction to come up and we become disrespectful, it all falls apart. We feel very strongly about that. And so for example, we appreciate your candid comments and your questions and your disagreements. That's part of this healthy process that we're going through. We welcome that. Thank you for that. And we hope that you will go out and be an influence to create that kind of inquiry and that kind of process with the people with whom you work and associate.
Absolutely. Okay. One of the questions, can you do the psych safety cert before EQ? Yes, absolutely. They're interchangeable that way in terms of sequence. It doesn't matter which one first. You will all get access to the recording. I'm trying to filter through here for some questions. Tim, do you see anything in here? I'm getting a lot of other stuff. Okay, what are some more specific beliefs about others that produce manipulative intent? That's an interesting question. So one of the things that we have to think about is, what do we think about other people? And so I think that this is something that we all need to be introspective about and ask ourselves some very penetrating questions about, what do we think about other people, right?
So I have a comment on that. And I hope that you'll read the book, because you can hear my full discussion on this. The biggest reason is when people try to assert superiority on some basis. This is where things fall apart. So I'm better than you, I'm superior. I'm going to invoke superiority based on some characteristic or factor. Could be race, age, education, ethnicity, geography, occupation, position, power, money, family, you name it. Pick a factor. But when we start to claim superiority, invoke some what I call really a false or a junk theory of superiority on any basis, then we get into trouble. We lose our rich collaboration.
Agree wholeheartedly. Okay. Why are we seemingly so prone to surrendering to corruption and lies, the celebration of the destructive dark side? It may be too ponderous to cover, but it's on my mind. Thanks, Tim. That is a really interesting question, because if you look at history, the history of our planet is one of corruption and lies in many respects. And I think I don't have an answer for you why we're prone to that. But I think that one of the things that we talk about with psychological safety is a lot of that behavior comes from a deep sense of insecurity at the individual level. And if you really crack open the regimes that have destroyed pieces of our world and pieces of our history, and you look at the leaders behind them, you can see just how interesting and penetrating the regard pieces of their personality and their behavior and beliefs might be. Because as soon as those things start to get offline, you can have potential for a lot of destruction, because a lot of those regimes are backed by highly competent people who may score very highly on the other dimensions of emotional intelligence, which is why they're so successful in what some may call leadership. We wouldn't by intent, but as far as influencing other people, they can do that pretty successfully, for better or worse. And so that's one of the things that I personally have been thinking about, is cracking ourselves open, as Tim would say, taking a look inside and asking ourselves some pretty deep questions about why we do what we do and what we believe about other people.
I agree. Good comment.
Okay.
Any other questions that we want to address?
none that I think we can get through in the next 30 seconds. So we'll go
That's
ahead and let
true.
everybody hop off. So thank you for spending part of your day with us today. We appreciate you very much. We appreciate you being part of the community and hope you have a wonderful weekend. So with that, we'll sign off. We'll get you this recording pretty soon and hope to hear from you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.